Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a joint review of The Book of Forgotten Authors by Christopher Fowler. This was a buddy read between Ange of Beyond the Pages and myself, and this review is also a collaboration. The Book of Forgotten Authors is a 2017 collection of bite-sized essays about just what the title says. Authors that were once immensely popular that have fallen off the cultural radar. They're no longer in print, no longer read so widely. No longer remembered. This was a 4-star read for me. I enjoyed it very much. Obviously, what I loved the most was that it introduced me to, there's 99 essays, so there's short profiles of 99 writers that most of whom I'd never heard of before. Of those, there was at least 20 or more that I really want to read. And I'm going to tell you about 3 a little later. But what I really appreciated was the writing was, for the most part, really wonderful. Fowler turns a phrase very nicely and has some quite lovely insights into popular fiction, talking about fiction in a way that sets it in its decade or in its historical time. There was a lot of insight like that. His essay on the Booker Prize was, I thought, very interesting and thought-provocative. So yeah, the writing is good, the wonderful details. So I'm just going to share 3 quick details with you. He devotes not a whole essay, but a few paragraphs to a woman from the late 19th century, early 20th century, Amanda McKittrick Ross, who was regarded as the worst writer of all time. And he quotes from her, and I looked one of her books up on the internet, and yeah, I would support that evaluation. Her most famous novel is Irene Iddesleigh, published 1897. This is the tidbit. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis used to have contests over who could read the lengthiest excerpt from that novel without laughing. Which kind of gives me the idea for another BookTube tag, don't you think? E.M. Delafield, most famous for her diaries, Diary of a, I've forgotten the name. A Diary of a Provincial Lady, I think, is her most famous book, which I just picked up at the used bookstore the other day. But her real name was Edme Elizabeth Monica de la Pasteur, daughter of a count, and of an immensely popular and funny writer. And she once worked on a Russian collective farm. A few paragraphs devoted to the Catalan writer Joan Petrucco, and this little nugget that just fascinated me. On St. Jordi Day in Catalonia, Catalans present each other with a book and a rose, and authors, quote, stroll the city, signing volumes, close quote. All right, so now let me just highlight 3 authors that were new to me that I very much want to read. The first one is Norman Collins, a British novelist and BBC media personage, and I think also a print journalist. And his novel from 1945, London Belongs to Me, 700-plus page sprawling novel in the style of Dickens, as long as it doesn't have Dickens sentimentality, I'm okay, considered one of the great city novels. Follows the fortunes of the down-on-their-luck tenants of number 10 Dulcimer Street in Kennington, South London. I think Ange and I are going to be buddy reading this one very soon. And it was made into a movie starring Richard Attenborough. Probably out of the whole book, the one that I think Ange agrees with me, that I was most excited about, had absolutely never heard of this writer, and can't wait to explore her fiction, is Cynthia Proper Seton. She was born in 1926 in New York State and wrote mildly feminist novels. I can't remember when they began to be published, in the 70s maybe. She died in 1982, very young. She wrote 6 novels, and they were about middle-class wives and mothers that were not happy with their lives, but they didn't hate the men in their lives, but they had problems with them. And her fiction has been compared to George Eliot, Proust, and Jane Austen. Why have we not heard of this woman? And I cannot believe that all 6 of her novels are in print at Amazon Japan, not from a third party where you wait 10 days for it to come from England or something, but they're in stock in Tokyo. I could get those books tomorrow from Amazon. who is this woman? She sounds amazing. So Ange and I that was a wasp or something. Ange and I are going to be buddy reading one of hers very soon. And the third one that I want to quickly tell you about is Roy A.K. Heath, born in Guyana and moved to the UK, I'm not sure when, but a Guyanese British writer, committed Marxist, lawyer, and school teacher before he became a writer. He's most well known, but I'd never heard of him, for his trilogy, the Armstrong trilogy. The novels are From the Heat of the Day, One Generation, and Genetha, which powerfully evoked Guyana, and then the stories move into the UK, I think. He was Booker shortlisted for one of his novels, The Shadow Bride, and most famous for a psychological thriller, The Murderer, which Salman Rushdie praised as being unforgettable. His son is one of the founders of the Europop band Urban Cookie Collective, already then, but I was very curious to try a Roy Heath novel. Okay, so those are the three, among many others, that I was very interested to read. This was not a perfect book, however. Just for my personal tastes, too many of these writers were genre fiction writers, especially thriller writer. Christopher Fowler himself is a thriller novelist, so fine. But I think he spread himself too thin, and there was just essay after essay where, because I'm not interested in sci-fi or mystery or thriller, although, like I say, I did try the Charlotte Armstrong suspense novel and loved it, so maybe it was a good exercise, but I did skim several of these because there was so much genre fiction. There was Barbara Pym, and there was Ronald Furbank, and then there's all these dime store thriller novelists. It's too much of a mixed bag for my taste. It was too white. That last writer I mentioned, Roy Heath, was the only non-white writer included. There may have been one other that I've forgotten of, but it was a very, very white and UK America-centric book. There was too many writers here that Fowler wrote about disparagingly. New Age quacks and spiritual novels that sounded just ridiculous, and Fowler found them ridiculous. So why devote an essay to the writer? Just leave them out. And what's just struck me as Ange and I both as ridiculous, there's a very interesting essay about non-English language writers who have been largely forgotten, and I would say 60% of them, Fowler said, oh, they're not translated, or not, the translation's gone out of print, or what. No, most of them just not translated. Well, why write about that? That drove me crazy. And finally, the most complicated criticism, became much more complicated of a criticism about 10 minutes ago, is the way that he writes about the gay authors. Either he doesn't mention that they were queer, Ronald Furbank. How ridiculous to write a 5-page essay about Ronald Furbank and not mention that he was gay. Jesus Christ, that just pissed me off. Or there was just felt like a real discomfort in the way he addressed homosexuality in the lives of several of the writers. Just seemed he was really uptight about it in the way that he phrased it or whatever. So I thought, well, that's, I quickly checked his Wikipedia while I was reading it a couple of weeks ago, and he's 65 years old, so that's the way straight men of that era would probably write about these kind of topics, perhaps, but I wasn't happy about it. And I'm so glad I went back to check today because he's gay. He won the Green Carnation Prize, its inaugural year, for his memoir about his lonely gay boyhood in England. So I still have the same criticism, but it's from his own self-repression, I guess, that homosexuality was so discomforting for him as I read through those essays. But anyway, all of that said, this was an amazing book, and it's introduced me to a whole pile of writers, and now you're going to hear Ange give her review.
Guys, it's Ange, and I'm also here to talk about the Book of Forgotten Authors by Christopher Fowler. And so I really enjoyed reading this with Shawn, and we had so much fun discussing every chapter in this. and we both had the same opinion about this book. There were a lot of things that we both liked in this book, and then also some of the dislikes where Fowler likes to completely not tell you about something, and that there were just too many genre fiction authors or white authors in this. There were not enough people of colour, and I believe there weren't enough females in this either. I was kind of flipping through it earlier today and realised that there were not that many female authors in this book either. And so today I thought I would talk about 3 of the female authors that were spoken about in this book, and tell you about those 3 female authors and why I want to read some of their works now after reading about them in this book. So the first author that I want to talk about is Margarita Lasky. Now, I read about her in this book, and I had just started a book by her called Tory Heaven, and we came up to that chapter, and I had already read a chapter in Tory Heaven, and I was so excited to find her in here. So I definitely want to keep reading her works. I really enjoyed her book Tory Heaven, and so she had a really fascinating life. She was born in the UK in 1915, and she attended Oxford to study English, and she also worked in journalism and fashion, and she also got married in Paris. So she did have a very privileged life. She was very well off, but she went on to do a lot of good things, and she wrote a lot of books. So firstly, one thing that I liked was that she was a compulsive contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary. She became the science fiction critic for The Observer. She was active in campaigns for nuclear disarmament. She was vice chairwoman of the Arts Council. She was a biographer, a novelist, a playwright, and a short story writer. And so she did a lot of things in her time. And there were 3 books that were mentioned that really piqued my interest. So the first one is The Village, which is one that I'm actually going to read in June, hopefully. And this one is about people separated by class, and apparently it is evocative and unsentimental. And then there is A Little Boy Lost, which is about a English soldier during World War II, and after World War II he decides to go to France to find his young son, and he finds him in an orphanage, I believe, and then struggles to truly find out whether this is actually his son or not. And then there is the Victorian Chi Lodge, which is one of her most famous works, I believe, and it is about a woman who is recovering from tuberculosis, and her family buy this chaise for her to lie on, so she is moved from the bed to this that they bought at a junk shop. And when she is lying on this and falls asleep, she wakes up in a body back in the Victorian era that is also sickly, and she has different people around her, and apparently it's supposed to be eerie and creepy, and it just sounds so great. So I'm very much looking forward to reading this one as well. And it's also a very short novel, so I think I'm definitely going to buy this one very soon and hoping to read it. So I believe Shawn also wanted to read some of Margarita Lasky's books with me. So she also had a long and happy life. So she is definitely one author that I definitely want to read. The next author is an Australian author, and that is Patricia Carlon. She was born in 1927 in New South Wales in Wagga Wagga, and it's spelt Wagga Wagga if people not in Australia don't know. She apparently wrote very nerve-wracking, sort of murdered, sort of very eerie and disturbing stories that have very strong Australian themes. But she couldn't find a publisher in Australia. No one wanted to publish it here, but she soon found a publisher in the UK who went on to publish 14 novels by her during 1961 and 1970. And she found success in Britain, and then her stories were then discovered in Australia and America, and they were finally published in Australia 40 years after her works were published in the UK. Her writing is said to be intelligent, hard-hitting, she's got simple prose, and her books can be very odd. 2 that stood out to me was The Whispering Game and Hush, It's a Game. Another interesting fact about Patricia was that she became deaf at 11 years old. So she really understood what it felt like to be lonely and not being able to communicate with others. And it is said that she brings these themes into her novels. So I'm really intrigued about reading her novels, especially because she's from Australia and she's an Australian author, and her novels just sound absolutely fascinating. So I'm very much looking forward to reading some works by her. And the last one that I want to talk about is Eleanor Hibbett. And she is interesting because she used a lot of pseudonyms for when she wrote her books. One of her most famous pseudonym was Victoria Holt. And I actually do have a book by Victoria Holt, and it is a historical fiction that is gothic and is sort of a mystery sort of book. So I'm definitely going to hopefully read that very soon, or at least in the near future. She was born in 1906. She used other pseudonyms as well, not just Victoria Holt. She used Elba Ford, Jean Platty, Philippa Carr, Kathleen Kelo, and quite a few others. And she went on to write 200 novels in her time, and she was first published in 1941. So she covered an array of different things in history. She covered the Normans, the Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Georgians, the Victorians. She wrote Gothic romance, she wrote mystery, she wrote non-fiction. She wrote so many different things in her time. And Fowler also said that she enjoyed writing feisty women, and I love feisty women, so I'm excited to read something by her. And it was also said that during the winter months in England, she used to take a cruise every year to escape the winter months, and she died in her 80s on a cruise between Greece and Egypt. There was also one quote that was quoted in the book that really got to me, and that is, "Never regret. If it's good, it's wonderful. If it's bad, it's experience." And I love that quote, so that's why she really stood out to me. And I wanted to mention a few other authors. I'll just mention them by name if you want to go check them out. The other authors that I was interested by include Cynthia Seton, which I believe Shawn talked about, and so she was one that I was really intrigued by. And there was also Gladys Mitchell. She was known as Mad Miss Mitchell, so that was the first line in the chapter, which I found really intriguing. And then Kathleen Winsor, and she wrote a book that was over 2,000 pages long, but her publisher whittled it down to 1,000 pages, and I believe it was historical fiction that was set in the Restoration period. So that's one that I definitely want to read because I do love big books. So, yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this book. I would think I would give it about a 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed reading about authors that I've never heard of. There were essays in between, which I found dull at times, but some were interesting. I really did enjoy the one about translated works. But what really frustrated me about Christopher Fowler was that he would mention a book and say that it wasn't translated. We did find out that some of them have been translated, so I will definitely be checking out some of those. It was just so interesting to find out about these authors. I just kind of wish that he had some bit more diversity, I suppose, in this. And sometimes I wondered why he added some of the authors in this that he did. But overall, a really enjoyable read, and I had so much fun reading this with Shawn.